Well, what I'm going to share with you is some big ideas, some things to think about. If you've looked at my book, and it's obviously fine if you haven't, then you'll know that one of the things actually the main thing I do in there is ask questions and give people tools to think with, sort of ways to address issues, right, that are going on all around us all the time. And there's no single answer to any one of these issues, right? Technology is a tool. It can be used well, it can be used poorly. So what I like to do is give people ways to think more carefully and more concretely about the issues that are at stake so they can use technology rather than have technology use them. And of course, because I'm a religious studies professor, I filter all of these issues through religious studies and thinking about religion. So we'll just walk through some of this. I have a couple of videos I'll show you. And it'll just sort of raise lots of issues for you. I also like to pack lots of things in so that people then have lots of questions and lots of thoughts. And it's up to you. This is your time. If you want to jump in and have some discussion, I think after the videos that'll feel natural to you. But I'm just going to keep going, and if you want to interject, feel free. I always like to start with a picture of a smart device because most people, and I usually talk to college-age students, and almost universally, everyone has a device. So I say, how many people has one of these? And I actually see one.
Just turn it off. Turn off the ringer.
Demo. But we're very much involved, right, with technology. And so much of our lives is now passed through a screen, right? You're experiencing this through a screen. And anytime there's a screen involved, there's programming involved. Someone has decided what you can do, what you can't, what it's possible to see, what it's not, what choices you have, and what choices are completely left off the table. So technology actually does constrain, right? Sometimes in welcome ways, sometimes in unwelcome ways, the choices that we can make in our daily lives. So anytime our experiences are filtered through that screen, we should ask, right, what's possible and what's not, given the programming. And also in the chapter on identity, one of the other things I find really interesting about smart devices is they say something about who we are. So when I work with my students, I'll say, think about how personalized this device is to you. It's sort of an attachment, right, to who you are. And the apps, the little programs, each of these icons represents a program, says something about who you are and how you engage with the world because you choose to put them on there, right? But we choose to put them on there, and then sometimes we take them off, or sometimes they're no longer updated. So it's also a really nice visual of the ephemeral self. How today people less often think of themselves as sort of having a fixed identity, that we're very much a part of this flow that technology invites. This is an external visualization of who we are, but it's constantly changing, and we're playing an active role in its formation. And so I like this shot. This is from the 70s. This is from California in the 70s, right? The origins of Silicon Valley, and everyone's really excited about what's possible with computers, right? You can go into this other world and experience new and exciting things. Everyone was really optimistic. And some people are still optimistic. And like I said, it's a neutral tool, right? So it can go either way. But one of the things I'm really interested in too is the way that the screen can serve as a space where we put our dreams, right? These are the ways that we imagine the world to be. And we think anything is possible with communication. It can connect us to people around the world, right? And it can. It doesn't always do that, and some of the constraints that programmers place on it can work against that, right? But this is sort of a vision of optimism that people have with technology. And religion is implicated in this use of technology, both in good and less good ways. And so these are some quotes from some of my favorite people dealing with these issues relating to religion. And they all just really, I guess I can read them to you. Religion of every kind, big and small, old and new, mainstream and more exotic, is present online and in great abundance. So any kind of religious practice that happens offline, people are trying to find a way to experience it online. And that raises some really interesting questions, which we'll go into a little bit more in a bit. Mary Hess, it makes little sense to write about media practices separated in any way from practices of faith more generally. Now, one of the things I'm also interested in is the way that media can serve as a proxy for religious experience itself, meaning that because we see that screen as representing ideal dreams and what's possible, that it also is similar to the ways that people have traditionally imagined heaven. That there's this ideal space behind this screen, right, where all of our dreams can come true, where positive things can happen, right, and so we can project ourselves into those spaces.
It just occurred to me that I worked for over 25 years for the computer company, which really drove human interface.
Yeah.
And we had a screen, CRT screen, in 1960 at MIT on a pretty good sized computer that you could There wasn't a mouse because the mouse hadn't been invented, but you could drive that screen with a joystick.
Yeah.
And one of the first games was Lunar Landing, which is a heavenly extraterrestrial kind. It just occurred to me that it started that way.
You're absolutely right? We imagine other worlds and other spaces, which is what religion has always been about, and we're constantly manufacturing these worlds and these spaces, many of which we feel like we have some control over the storytelling, which will be really interesting for you in thinking about that mythology. We can both enter into those otherworldly mythical spaces that are being built, and also we want to have more control, which is why we have that joystick, right? There's an increase in human agency that we are manufacturing with the technology because we have control over what we make possible.
Can I also suggest that not only is that space an ideal space, but I'm really also interested in religion and how it psychologically can give, religion makes space for atonement, which, people screw up all the time, and it's a place to go to reflect and repent in some way, whatever that means to you, feel better, try to correct it, or if you can, and then come back into the self. So it is. So anyway, so online can also not only just be a place to be ideal, but also for control. But when you're feeling out of control because you screwed up, to go there, set yourself right again, and then enter back into relationship with others.
I do think that those kinds of spaces and digital environments have to be set up very carefully. Because the marketing and the drive towards violent games and those kinds of things can really work against that, but there are people who are trying to create those spaces because the programming shapes what's possible, right? It shapes the options before you. So I think there's a lot of room for people to go in and create more environments, and there are some, right, that do encourage that kind of engagement, and that would be sort of more online discussion boards that have moderators, sort of humans sort of shaping the interaction, right, versus where I'm going to end up, which is thinking about first-person shooters, which are the exact opposite, right, of what you're talking about with sort of this binary of us versus them. So you're absolutely right. So one sort of question to take away is, what kinds of things are we investing the most in terms of shaping behaviors, right? Because one of my main arguments, and again I'll get this in a moment, is that when we engage with technological spaces, it's a ritual kind of engagement, because what rituals do is they constrain us, right? And usually we're happy with that kind of being constrained because it sort of focuses our attention, right, like you were saying. But if it's focusing our attention in terms of some of these violent games, then it's teaching us and shaping us in negative ways, but it's also possible for it to shape us in positive ways. And then the limit speak. Technology is so embedded itself in our lives that it's no longer considered a separate category, but part of everything. So it's hard to escape, right? Very, very hard to escape today. And this is me. Today's environments are restricted, right? So we think that it's all positive, but there are, like I've already said, sort of restrictive kinds of procedures. There's authentications. It sort of aggregates our friends. If you're on Facebook or social media, it says talk to these people, and the people that aren't there are not sort of real for you, right? I do have a couple of friends I've made who live in Turkey and Iran, right? I've met them at conferences in real life, and now they're my friends. But for the most part, I don't really interact with people on a global scale in social media, but it feels that way, right? So sort of thinking about what's actually happening, right, versus what's possible and what could be happening, maybe cultivating that one too. And the more religion gets wired, this is sort of the main point, the more it incorporates the values of the software it embraces. Technology, again, is not always neutral, right? It shapes our experiences. Yeah, I'm not responsible for that image, but it's really fun. So a little bit about some of the non-controversial uses of technology. This is from Catholic Online, and this is the Stations of the Cross. And so one of the things I talk about in the book a lot are when we take religious experiences and we put them online, how are they changed and how they're not. And this one, it's changed some in that you're not sort of in an embodied space looking at the images, walking around. Perhaps some of the communal stuff is diluted, right? But in terms of thinking about particular moments in the story in order, that's encouraged here because you can only click previous station or next station. It makes you go in a particular order, and you can go backwards and you can go forward, but it's a pretty rigid constraining of that experience, okay? So compare that to this, which is, for some people, quite an offensive online game. And you play as Jesus. I've chosen the most misogynist moments in the game to illustrate to you. And so you fight, but you'll notice that there are elements of the familiar story at work here.
Right.
They've just been so transformed by the interactive experience, right, that it's become something completely different. You have control over that story, right, in very limited ways. And then the weapons as well, cross smash, crown of thorns, fishes and loaves, these are weapons that Jesus can use. So, I'm going to give you a term in a moment called procedural rhetoric, right, which is just a term for thinking about what processes are at work when you're engaging with a digital experience. And here, the procedural rhetoric is, you must fight. You must fight as Jesus, right? And so part of the humor comes from that sort of surprise that the procedural rhetoric is forcing you to engage in a particular way with the familiar elements of this story, right? And in a way that works against the original teaching or the traditional teaching.
So was this endorsed or manufactured by a particular religious organization?
This
Just want to be sure.
meant to be playful. Although it's on one of those sites that a lot of kids access, you know, where they have sort of lots of games that you can play.
Is this an actual game?
Yes.
Oh.
Which I had to play to get this screenshot, which this is one of the disturbing aspects. I didn't enjoy that.
You say familiar, and I'm always amazed at how many people have no clue of what the Bible is or what Bible stories are. So this is many people's first interface with loaves and fishes and big leaves, and it doesn't associate with anything neutral or positive or religious.
That's a great point. That's a wonderful point. So it's one of the dangers of technology, especially for youth. If they can't recognize how the game is being transformed, then all they get is the new form and whatever it teaches.
Or that's the original template then in their brain
That's right.
on which everything else kind of.
That's right.
Jesus is a spider.
Yeah.
I was just gonna make the same point that you made. You know, Jesus wasn't even around during the Garden of Eden, but nor were unicorns. But okay.
Where's the snake?
So-
Where's the snake?
Where's the snake?
Where's the snake?
I'm surprised that Jesus' weapons don't have anything about the horsemen of the apocalypse or any kind of end of the world talk.
Well, it's also atomized, right? It's fragmented. You're
Yeah,
right.
it
It
really
has to
is.
be simplified. That's the other thing that happens with games is it has to be simplified, it has to be transformed into a form that has points and winners and losers.
For 6 years.
Well, that's an interesting point because I think that's what media is tending to do is simplify everything down to the dumbest level so that there's only a yes-no situation. And so that's part of the problem with our democracy today.
Binaries. Yeah, in my second book, which I'm just starting to work on now, I'm really interested in that problem of binaries and the way that technology is sort of thrusting us toward what I'm calling the apocalyptic mindset, the sort of us versus them, right? And some sort of desire for ending and finality, or at least purpose and conclusion, right? Which has been around for thousands of years in the apocalyptic mindset, but now it's resurfacing in our technology full force. I think you're right. It's a way of coping with the anxiety of globalization, right? Diversity, all of the sort of problems that we don't know how to cope with. This is it's problematic, but for many people it's a comforting space to land because the choices are clear. Even if people are just doing it for fun as a temporary escape, right? It feels comforting to them, and for some people they want to abide there all the time.
So, just to play I don't want to say devil's advocate, but the snake's advocate maybe. To some extent, this is already being taught to 6-year-olds. I mean, you have children who are taught that Eve's got original sin. You got children who are taught that God rightly drowned almost everybody on earth. So that kind of stuff is already going on. If children witnessing prayers for soldiers and things. So having the fighting Jesus being kind of an idea. Is this not just taking that kind of extreme position and then posting a marker and saying that we can have more freedom in expressing who Jesus and Eve are, so that then all of those areas in between are now open to us? I mean, is this just maybe an extreme protesting version of this, but just another way to take ownership of the characters and plays?
Sure, sure. Well, yeah, the notion of play is something we're going to get to in just a moment, but yeah, absolutely. It's an expression of the programmer, right? Saying, this other view is possible, and it could even be satirical, right, in some respect. It's still going to have some of the problems, right, that you raised about the players who encounter it, and for them, their expressions are constrained. So one of the ways of thinking about it is creation versus consumption, right, because in today's society, there's a lot about expression, right? I'm going to take this song, or I'm going to take this text, and I'm going to transform it and create a YouTube video, and it's going to be my expression, with my freedom, right? But then someone else who's consuming that game is going to be limited by the constraints that you place upon it. So, yeah.
Well, that fits with some analysis of our present situation in the country, which is we used to be a production society, and now we're a consumption society.
Yeah, and I think the popularity of certain modes of gameplay, right, especially the violent ones, especially the sort of binary ones, says something about our desire to enter into those spaces the most, right, rather than construct spaces that allow exploration. But let me show you a few more things. I have many, many more, and I'll raise many, many more of these same issues for you. Let me get you through a few more of them. And the videos come after this. So, we talked about the smartphone before. One of the interesting things for religious groups to think about is if you want your group to be wired, how are you going to do it? And the facts are that unless you hire someone who's an in-house programmer and knows how to do this stuff, which will be very expensive and require lots of maintenance, then what you have to do is purchase a package, right? And that package is going to then shape what's possible for your community to do and not do online. Things like prayer trees not going to happen, right? Too expensive, and at least for now they're not on offer, but you can post podcasts, right? You can log into Facebook, which then brings with it its own questions because there's marketing involved, right? There's limitation of who can join and who can't. There's management involved. There's the whole problem of mood on social media, right? I'm sure if you're active on social media, you know that Facebook, for the most part, you have to be cheerful, and you can't really talk about being lonely or sick or, and so church communities have to sort of figure out how to address that problem. Also issues of privacy, right? So a lot of those kinds of questions come up. But the software that you can purchase that's affordable will constrain what you can and cannot do. And you can certainly work within those parameters. My goal is just to sort of make you aware, sort of think about what's possible and what's not possible here, and how will we supplement what this pre-designed, pre-packaged program cannot do. Something to be thoughtful about, yeah.
I just want everybody to know here, if you don't already, that Unitarian Universalist does have an app for not just lighting the chalice, which I think is a pretty cool one. The Church of the Larger Fellowship is a worldwide online virtual community for Unitarian Universalists who may be in places where they're just not close to a congregation. And so sometime today, people are going to be texting or doing their thing. There's an app, you can get it from the App Store. And they check in by saying the chalice is lit in Ithaca, the chalice is lit in Omaha, the chalice is lit in Phoenix, and there is actually a facilitator, a minister, who facilitates that experience for UUs. I think that's really, it's been around for years.
You know about it. How come we didn't know that?
Because we have this here.
And that would be one of those uses that's about bringing people together, right? A sort of thoughtful kind of engagement, creating a larger community. This is a cathedral, Anglican cathedral in England. I'm trying to fast forward to the most pertinent parts. They're going to use a video game, or they have already. This is a video that I'm talking about using this video game in their service. But it raises some really interesting issues about the integration of technology into worship. So we'll just see what you think about it, what issues it raises for you.
So it's not coming up on our screen.
Oh, that is odd. It's coming up on mine. I wondered if that was there. Now we just gotta get the sound. It's not down here. Is there volume on here? Yeah. Okay. Alright. And now we have to figure out how to get play from it over there. I think
You just move down then the play buttons, move them up.
Wait, we don't have this, the play buttons, oh, it showed up, okay. All right, we'll put it back and then
I've been working with the clergy here to incorporate the game in their service, which already had a theme of creation, and so the choice of using flower obviously was quite a good fit, as it engages with those themes and provides a really interesting way to look at how we interact with the world around us, and fitted really well with the themes that they wanted to use for their service. I think one of the interesting things of playing a video game in this context, much like playing in a family, is that they're going to be people of all ages and all experiences of video games. Some people maybe have played games a lot, maybe even have played Flower themselves, and some people who won't have played a game maybe at all. The service gets a congregation that ranges from around 20, 30, right up to 60, 70-year-olds. So I'm looking forward to seeing how, like in a family setting,
he explained this in the part I passed forward through, but this is not a game that you win. It's just a game that you sort of play as the wind and the petals blow, so it's sort of a meditative kind of game. Where is this taking place? It's Exeter Cathedral in England. It's Anglican.
Individuals respond to the game we're playing. For us here as a contemporary community, it's a chance for us to share in a journey. The game involves controlling a flower. So when technology works as a button, and you control them by just moving that control around. It's a body that each of us in turn can pass the control around. But because there's an so we can contribute to the journey of maintaining the other end of the around.
Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest. Stay with us on the day. With friend, with stranger, with young and with old. Be among us tonight. And bless us with the
We'll talk about it, yeah. They're gonna do communion here and then we'll stop.
He broke it and gave it to his friends, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body, my very self, given for you. Do this to remember me."
Is this a Catholic church?
It's Anglican.
Anglican.
Yeah. We'll go back to the show. No,
have their voice is kind of helpful, so it wasn't easy to.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay. Could you tell what was going on?
Only in the last bit where, this is my body, take and eat and so on, but
Right.
which normally is done in a spirit of great concentration.
Right.
There's nothing else going on except the priest's voice, and this is a point of great reverence and everything.
Yes.
And it's sort of like commentary on our short attention span these days. I mean, they can't have just that going on and nothing else. They have to have this thing.
Okay, so issues of mood and playfulness and the sort of seriousness of the moment, and also some really interesting things about sort of competing mediators, right? If for Anglicans, right, the communion is sort of the screen or the means of interacting, right? It's the mediating space where heaven meets earth. Then you have two of them. Are they competing with one another, right? And I'm going to phrase it as a question because I'm a professor and I sort of ask big questions and make people wrestle with them. And they clearly had to wrestle with this too, right? But you're saying that competition, right, that tension may be problematic in terms of distraction.
It negates the whole, original ceremony. There's no point.
There's a new ritual object.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Couldn't you say that also about the music? That you have the music could be originally set to interfere with that, or any of the other aspects of the cathedral, which are so artistic, that as looking at them, even as still objects, you could be mesmerized by one of those and miss what was saying. But you could also look at this as a new piece of art in the cathedral. I saw faces of delight, joy, and it could be seen as, enrapturing further, but it's a matter of perspective, right?
It really is.
Yeah, it's almost a combination of virtual reality and physical reality going on, and possibly getting great things out of it from both perspectives.
So for some people, that screen is a window into the transcendent, right? For some people, it's competition. For other people, it's a means end, right? And so there's definitely different perspectives. And it may depend upon one's age and one's experience or one's desire, right? It may.
What are they controlling?
Oh, you are
The pedals.
One of the pedals.
You're the wind.
All of them or one of them?
You're the wind,
Well, you're the wind.
which they're reading as the spirit.
So
That's
each
their
one of them, the machine is taking and combining what the group is saying. Okay.
So, but only one person plays at a time. So one
Oh.
person sort of blows
Oh, I thought they
as
were-
the spirit, right? And their reading of the game. The game is not intrinsically religious. It's made by Sony. It's meant to be meditative, right? But it's being used in a religious context here. So also that element of agency, right? So if we do view that controller as a ritual object, now we're more active, and we want that, right? That's sort of part of 21st century moment with technology. We want control. And so one could argue, again, sort of going the other direction, this is a way of having that sense of agency while keeping the original rituals intact. So you sort of still feel like you're doing
I
something.
could see how that could work. And after all, the whole cathedral itself was
There's been a hand up for
Right.
a while.
I was thinking of it from another standpoint, or looking at it different. If I were hard of hearing, for instance, that I couldn't hear the music or the speaking, but visually then, that wind and movement of the pedals might bring me closer to a softness within myself. Or if I was blind, then the music would add some aspect along with what the minister was saying. So I tried to say, what value does this have if you didn't have all of the senses working? Would it enhance what is working for you? So I tried to see some good in it, because for me this was bad, because I have all my senses and I wanted to shut it off. But I started thinking, wait, let's see what good it might have for some people.
That's right. And so one of the terms, I'm going to go ahead and give you, I'm going to jump ahead because I don't know what we'll get through, but I'm going to give you one of these terms because we've been using it, and it'll be really helpful as you're sort of weighing some things, and then we can return to the discussion. I'll go right back. But this is from a theorist. He's not interested in religion in particular. But he says that procedural rhetoric, having to do with technology, the practice of persuading through processes in general, and computational processes in particular. So a ritual has a procedural rhetoric, a way of arguing through procedures, right? So you could talk about the procedural rhetoric of the game, which would be blow as the wind, right? Make the paddles move, be meditative, right? But then you also, this is why I thought of it, think of the additional layer of what is the procedural rhetoric of the game in the worship context, right? What does it allow? What does it not allow? What does it encourage? What does it discourage? And so you'll see things that create tension, also things that open up new spaces, right? So if you really have to sort of ask about the particular experience, a particular group of people, right? The mood, all of these different things. There's no easy answer to whether or not one should do this in worship or not, right? There are a lot of different, and people will engage it in different ways. Some people will not like it, other people will like it for different reasons. But you can sort of think about what's at work, and this is a really useful tool. There were other people who wanted to say things.
So I just wanted to make a comment about internal versus external experience and the question of control some people are talking about, because say Bob has the thing and he's making the wind blow, but I'm sitting here completely out of control, then I have a more externally focused experience. When it comes to me, then I'm responding to my internal thoughts about what's going on. And so it's different for each person as opposed to those old rituals where there's some sort of communal experience.
That's right.
When everybody's lined up, kneeling and taking a little wafer and a wine glass.
It strikes me this is past defining the future in the sense that Brave New World talked about this kind of stuff in 1930s, and now we're here. And this is, I have a problem with this kind of technology in the sense that I think meaningful interrelationships can only occur between 8 to 12 people at one time. I mean, that's usually the situation. That's why I don't make discussion groups overly big.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that can happen, right, the more you wire your engagement, the less open-ended conversation can happen between those people, right? And the more that I might be engaging just with a machine rather than with a person. It's certainly possible to have meaningful engagement through a machine, right? Especially for those people who feel isolated, right? Who find their community online and elsewhere. They don't have one in their daily life, right? It can go either way. But I think thinking about how rigidly controlled the procedural rhetoric is can really help one assess in any given moment, which means that we all have to be constantly critical, constantly aware all the time. How is this engagement affecting me, right? What's possible and what's not in this particular moment with this device? How is it limiting my perspective? How is it expanding it?
Well, I was interested in the fact that email communication often leads to totally misinformation. And the fact that, as evolutionary speaking, we humans are tuned to use all of our senses simultaneously in terms of assessing whether they're hearing truth or fiction in whatever context we're talking about.
Mood. And all the different ways that we communicate in our body forms. That issue of the body is probably in the way it relates to community also, it's probably the biggest issue about religion online. How important is the body, right, to a given experience? So issues of like, can you have communion online, right? Catholics, absolutely not. There are other people who, certain versions of Protestants, right, who believe it's mostly symbolic, who believe that it can happen online, because there was one that I read about where they said get a can of tab and a bagel, right, and that you could engage in communion online because it's purely symbolic, so it doesn't really matter what the objects are. But of course, for Catholics, that bread and that wine is the medium, and so embodiment and the physicality is extremely important. And those issues have to do with communal engagement as well. I want to maybe give you a couple more of the tools before I lose you or somebody have to go. There are many more things we could do. I'll just run quickly through these. This is the virtual world Second Life. And again, it raises different issues. This is me on Hajj. I got a free hijab and I felt like wearing it in the virtual space, even though I didn't have to. It felt like the right thing, even though this was a virtual Hajj. So another issue that I'm just going to gloss over and leave you to think about is when people replicate virtual spaces online, one of the things that can be replicated is the mood, you get a sense of the geography, right? But because I'm not Muslim, I couldn't actually go on Hajj in real life. And so issues of sort of how one can and should act. In the book I talk about wanting to go here with my students several years ago. It doesn't exist anymore, by the way, they've taken Mecca down. One of my students wanted to log in and he was dressed as Batman. Turned out to be a great discussion point. Can you materialize in Mecca as Batman? Not something you'd have to deal with in real life. Really a great theological question to wrestle with. I mean, is it disrespectful to Muslims there or not? It's a playful environment, right? But not really in these spaces. And there I am kissing the black stone using an animation that allowed me to do it. And these big floating numbers that I presume do not actually exist in Mecca either, that sort of tell you the order to do things. So it's sort of like a map, but it's so immersive and interactive that it's also a little bit like a sacred space.
Where are all the other people? There's supposed to be this huge swirl of people.
Right, but it's virtual, so they're probably in the real space if they can be there. And also, I think time differences as well. So people who would choose to be there, I was there when they were probably all asleep. So that's part of it too. Although people, when I was in there in my hijab, people would show up in costume and then get very nervous and leave because they perceived me as Muslim because of the way I was virtually dressed. So some really interesting issues come up.
Really interesting.
Yeah. And for the sake of time, I'm going to reserve this video. We could watch it if maybe after 10, if those people who are still around. It's a very short video about a Protestant worship service in Second Life, and you'll see there's a dancing troll, so some of the same kinds of issues of mood arise. It's a really fascinating video, but I'll save it. You can visit all kinds of virtual spaces in Second Life. Here's a synagogue, and the actual construction of these spaces is part of the religious expression because these have to be built digitally from scratch, right, piece by piece. And so there's a ritualized experience, just an I'm going to make a space that sort of expresses who I am religiously in real life. I have a friend who has built and runs LGBT church in Second Life. And this is a safe place, right, for people to go and worship, who in real life, and she's been running for several years. I think this is less of an issue now than maybe it was even 3 years ago. But that's one of the things that Second Life can provide. Rituals in this space, people can get married, but they might really be married, or they might just be virtually married. They might be playing at getting married. All different sorts of degrees of authenticity can happen in these spaces. This game caused a big stir, again, at the Anglican Church in England. This is a perfect replica of Gloucester Cathedral in England, and this is a very popular video game. They digitally copied the church, but you shoot aliens in it. And the Anglican Church called this virtual desecration because it was such a perfect digital copy, and violence was procedurally placed right within the space. And they said it's just a game. The church said no, it's not. You've put violence into our space, and we're already dealing with gun violence on our streets. So another set of questions emerges.
Of course, the violence of Jesus on the cross in that space is kind of overlooked.
Sure. Yeah, there's a procedural rhetoric involved in that story and the way that
a longer history.
Sure. All right, so here's the tools. Procedural rhetoric I've given you. Play. There's lots of definitions of play, but one of the ones that I find really useful if you're thinking about ritual in particular is from Eric Zimmerman, who was a game design theorist, and you see the steering wheel. And he says, if we think of any kind of experience as having a sort of structured sort of path that you're supposed to follow, right? If you do the ritual, do this, then say this, then move this way, then say this, then you're done, right? That it's sort of like a symbolic road, right? I've got a visualization of it down here. So there's what's expected. Do these things in this order. Each of those circles represents something you say or something you do, right? How much wiggle room do you have? Perhaps in between you can give your own thoughts. That's a little veering, or maybe you could dance for a few minutes, improvise, right? It's anything that's not scripted is sort of when you veer off the path a little bit. And so then the ritual has both scripted elements, right, and sort of improvised elements. So play, by this definition, is how far you can turn the steering wheel without going off the road. So you can apply this to film too, right? Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ, he went in the theological ditch, right? Because people are like, you can't say that about Jesus, you can't, and right? Whereas Mel Gibson, he's kind of driving like this, but he managed to mostly stay on the road, right? He told the things he should have told, mostly the order that people expected it, and some people didn't even notice he was doing this, right? So you can apply it to film, you can apply it to games and ritual.
You know, they call it a lot of this play, but I'm really curious as to, my mind is still on that church picture with the monsters. Is much of this like bucking the society or bucking the tradition?
This?
Like, yeah. This
Perhaps.
Like based in anger, based in rebellion.
Some of
Because
us.
particularly England, you know, they're very, very deep in division and so on. But so many of them.
I think you could read it that way. I will say that Sony, there were letters that flew back and forth because there was a threat of a lawsuit. That's why this case is, I wrote a whole chapter just on this case in a book. This was one scene, this was their defense. This was one scene among many, right, hundreds in an entire game that projected an alternate history. So there were plenty of battles with aliens that took place in other recognizable locations. It's just that this one popped out for the church because it's their space.
Yeah, but I'm even thinking of the first thing that you showed at the beginning with Jesus.
Yeah, the Bible
and that whole game. You know, for some it's considered sacrilegious. And so again, is the society saying, the hell with all of that, we have a new way of finding the spirit or whatever, but there's an element of rebellion to it, I think.
And that rebellion is itself a form of play, right? We're going to take the architecture of the church, that's going to stay intact, but we're going to play.
As long as it's virtual.
Well, angry play.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Play isn't always of a particular mood. I think that's a great
There's a
turn
lot
to
of
point.
D&D players, there's a lot of angry play.
Sure. Yep. Play isn't always fun. Play isn't always nice by this definition. It's observing whatever structure is received, be it textual, ritual, architectural, and then looking at how people are resisting and interacting with that given structure. So absolutely, I think you could say it was angry play.
I find it puzzling that we can say that with tolerance for violence, but if that was rape, would be treated the same way.
There have been cases of virtual rape.
Oh,
I'm just asking, would we react to it with the same sense of tolerance? Sure, kids play violent games.
There is
Why not?
murder.
Right.
Sure, kids kill people. Why not?
Right.
Rape is something different.
Right, and you know, and I'm probably not going to get to this as much, but yeah, so the violent games, right, like Resistance Fall of Man, there are many others, where the procedural rhetoric is shoot or die, right? That's really the ritual lesson that's taught, right? And lots of people argue about whether or not it's going to make you pick up a gun. I tend to think that that's a red herring, because most people aren't going to, some people are, but most people aren't going to have easy access to guns, at least
Rachel,
still today.
what did we have before though? If you don't follow the rules, you're going to hell for all eternity.
That's interesting. So with these, for example, how different is this than what we might find in some of the images in the Sistine Chapel, those people being pulled down by demons? And then what about the historical context of what the Anglican Church dealt with in terms of the fight over images in churches between Protestants and Catholics who ended up actually not virtually, but killing people. So it's very interesting in that sense.
Thank you, I gotta go, I have a duty dance.
All right. I want to mention, because I didn't quite finish my thought, that the procedural rhetoric, right, I don't think it's going to make people necessarily pick up a real gun, but I do worry that it might encourage binary thinking, right, which is one of the places I began. I do think it may encourage people to say friend or foe. Are you with me or against me? Right, I think that habit of thinking is more likely.
A number of years ago, I was in Lord Strait Hall, where things are always kept immaculate and well repaired and everything, and they had a game room and you stepped in there and you could see where people had kicked holes through the walls, punched their fists through things, and I think some of this brings out the wrong behavior in people. I think there's evidence for that, to be honest. Is that something we want to encourage? It doesn't seem to help control these urges, it seems to make them worse.
Well, that's one of the things theorists are arguing about right now, very much so, right? Does it teach that behavior, or does it provide a space to bend that behavior, right? And it may be different for individual people as well. You've been wanting to say something.
Well, I think it's probably diluted at this point, but I just want to say, as somebody looking at this image, what I'm seeing is the church being a symbol of structure and, for me, peace and tradition. And then it's a matter of contrast. Then you have this layer of something, whoa, not traditional, whoa, very chaotic, not, so for me, it's not so much, okay, clearly the aliens are showing us that we're just bucking the system of traditional religion, but it's what is going to get the player to be conflicted about two different images that symbolically mean two very different things. And that emotional response to those binary thinkings, I don't know if there's a word for binary feelings, but that will propel the game.
Like the contrast.
The contrast.
Yeah. And I like this contrast. But I'm going to go back to what Jonathan said. I think that these two perspectives are what it's about is those images that are in a lot of those old churches, the demons and all, they're exactly this, and they evoke this emotion, and we must have somehow blocked that feeling in our mind to be able to go in there. And I feel that every time I see that Jesus on the cross, I feel that violence, and I can't look at those images, but everybody who does have that in their dining room that they eat under, somehow is dealing with it mentally.
Yeah.
Right, but then they see it as an image of salvation and of something else. So there can be a way of also maybe looking at this in the same way that there are multiple ways in the context to look at. I mean, that's what Jennifer is saying. This could be a storyline about restoring peace to Gloucester Cathedral.
That's what some said.
Right.
Yeah. They said, wouldn't you want aliens killed if they came in your cathedral?
There's
Weird.
probably an interesting historical. When you first started your presentation, you said virtual space is a place for projecting your dreams and creating.
Yeah, that's right.
The cathedral itself, the notion of the church itself can be seen as a projection of a virtual space that doesn't exist in private communities.
That's right.
We create a public space, and yet it's dedicated to...
It's a kind of media.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, if that's true, why is it that people are projecting, their unique selves in this binary way? It's actually quite boring, right? I mean, how really creative can you be? Because it's not really so much about us, it's what the programmers give us to play with.
Yep.
That's what it's about. The programmers are God.
Which
It's
is
really
sort
how
of
it
like
is.
They have a huge
order of
responsibility.
service.
I always tell my students, if you're a computer programmer, you can shape the world because everything goes through the screen now, right? It's a huge responsibility. But I would also say programmers are part of a larger culture, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite books about this stuff. Acts of configuration, meaning programming, in video games and other programs too, express processes in culture that are large, unknown, dangerous, and painful, but they do not express them directly.
Yes, this is the part of the symbolic language, which is what religion is all about.
That's right. That's right. And so gaming can work as a kind of religion, expressing what we care about, what we're worried about, what we wish was true, what we're afraid of, all of those things. And it's doing it all the time. So our fascination with this particular binary mythology really says that we wish things were simpler than they are.
Okay.
I'd like to take this idea and shift it a bit. There was an article someplace this week, an analysis that on the planet today, religion and religious practice and people doing it is on the upswing. And it was quite at the Times or NPR or something like that, and I couldn't find it just now. Basically, one of the discussion points was that when the U.S., when the colonies were formed, there was no state church. And the church was essentially dying in England, and you could see it's dead by the congregation. In the U.S., where there was no state church, there was this gigantic explosive growth of all different kinds of religion, all different forms of religion, because people were kind of exploring it, and there was no inhibition to that, which was a fairly unique kind of thing for Western Europe, and indeed for the Ottoman Empire. I'm not sure about China. It went on to say that the active growth right now is in countries that are outside the more stylized U.S., Western Europe, i.e. south of the border, and that's where tremendous growth in different, and for old line Catholics, the way that Catholicism is being practiced in some of the countries in the Southern Hemisphere is a bit startling. So to me, the interesting thing in terms of technology and technology interface would be in those areas where there's a lot more yeasty growth and a lot more kind of experimenting. And, you know, Pope Francis, of course, is pushing that along. And so looking at it in Exeter Cathedral, to me, is like looking at King George III and saying, what can we learn from his politics? I would much rather look at a big cathedral or a ecumenical, you know, Protestant kind of thing in some of the other countries and see how technology is getting used.
And there are people who are doing that.
I bet.
The only other thing I would add real quickly as a thought is that I believe that technology and video gaming in particular is filling that gap for the nuns in America, that is working like religion for people with its own mythology, its own rituals, its own forms. We're all religious. It's got to find a way, right? And I think that gaming can provide a lot of those components. It's what's called implicit religion by scholars. And it's
so that yeasty kind of less experiment, you're saying, moves into the technology dimension, and so it is worthwhile looking at, say, Anglican environments or Catholic environments, traditional Catholic environments.
And American gaming culture, kids will line up 4 blocks deep to get the game at midnight. That's kind of religious, right? If they know every single line, they can memorize it, they're writing 100-page wikis about the game, they're dressing up as the characters, you know, they're ritually embodying those characters in comic cons, comic conventions. It's religion.
This week's Khan Academy ad, which I assume is targeted at about middle school, says, come here and learn how to write an app. Write your own apps. So, as you said a minute ago, the programmer's God. God training is going on in Khan Academy as we speak.
Yeah.
Rachel, what is your definition of religion?
I don't know.
All of the above.
Yeah, you know what? If you were to look at my book and you looked at each of the chapters, each of those is a facet. When I teach religion and culture, I go through a number of different units having to do with community, having to do with identity, having to do with ritual and play and storytelling and engagement with some sort of transcendent other. And there's no single definition of religion, but religion tends to cluster many of those features, right? And so if something becomes sort of popular enough that a number of those features sort of accrue and enough people are practicing, then it will manifest as a religion. But religion can only, I think, be defined from within by the individual. But if enough people agree about those features, people will recognize it as a religion. So look at the chapter titles, and that's the best, I think, we can do.
One of the things that really strikes me about this whole thing is that this tendency to enter virtual worlds versus our physical world reminds me of a lecture I took in sociobiology. Steve Emlin gave a lecture. It was one of his last lectures in that particular course. And he talked about the fact that the more we divorce ourselves from physical reality, the more we ignore what's going on around us to the point where we threaten our own existence in the long run. And so the question is, what is the tendency to ignore physical versus the entertainment of going to virtual?
You want to know what I think?
Yes.
We're ruining the earth, we're running out of water, we're getting so crowded, we don't know how to get along. It's very complicated to learn how to deal with people who have views that are different from us, and we don't want to do it. And this is programmed and safe and constrained.
So we're now becoming the dinosaurs then.
Yeah, and we're living in a fantasy because it makes it easier than having to sit down and engage with someone who sees radically
But
different way.
Don Postal just wrapped up the 35 lecture course on a role of theology,
Religion.
and it was the archaeological evidence. And throughout many of those presentations were on escaping from reality. People going up to the mountaintop to meditate. I think that's a common human trait. You can certainly trace it back into 3000 BC, and we're just seeing now a bigger chunk of it, or a technologically supported version.
Yeah, I'd say 60, 70%
People,
of
I
adults
think
play
if
games.
people were reading the Acts of the Apostle 200 years ago and getting into that whole thing was not much different than those animals in
Apocalyptic visions are like video games. I've argued that too.
read John's dreams there.
That's like a
I
video
hear
game.
what you're saying, but I think that's coming out of a different kind of creative process. And I think it strikes me, ridiculous, but we're closeting ourselves in technology. I do not own a cell phone, so let me I get criticized all the time by everybody around me.
Most family members, I think.
But it strikes me that this conformance within, I mean, this is a powerful tool to redirect things in a way that we have no control over.
Can I address that? Because if we can become, in a sense, programmers, I think there is an opportunity for control. This is a tool that is here. You just acknowledge it's very powerful.
Sure.
So then the question becomes, do we just let those people who do first-person shooters take control of this? Or do we then, in a community like this, take on the responsibility of addressing actually what is present in our culture right now and saying, how can we interface with that in a way that is in accord with our values and in a way that excites people and motivates them? So then this gets to one of the questions I wanted to ask you. So out of your book, there was this fascinating idea that feels right to me, where you were talking about how people who have grown up engaging in virtual worlds have a different kind of sense of self than people who are generations before, where people who log on to all these different accounts and go into different games have more of a plural sense of a mosaic identity, like I can be this, I can be that, I can be that and that. And then you wrote about how that affects their sense of religion, where they can say, instead of I am Catholic, they can say I take some things from Catholicism, some things from Buddhism, some things from Islam. So we're a congregation in transition, and one of the things that we need to look at when we're looking for a minister, or even the idea of whether we want to have a minister representing and leading and speaking to us, I think is that question of whether we are Universalist or Unitarian Universalists because we choose to belong to that tradition, or whether we go with this multiple sources idea in Unitarian Universalism. So then my question to you is then, if we have a majority of people in this congregation who are of the generation who came before the virtual world, and a minority of younger people, I mean, how do we even begin to talk about this question in a way that's respectful to both?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't think I can give you a quick answer, but the first thing that popped into mind was some kind of exercise where everybody could sit down, like ones with smart devices could sit down and say, why do you have those apps? What do those apps mean to you? And then the people who don't have smart devices say, here's what an app is. What apps or programs or religious experiences or preferences do you run in your own life? And sort of how do people sort of knit themselves together into these kinds of fluid goals? And then there could be exchange, right, across. That's just one small exercise.
Talking with each other.
Yeah, because you can use this model even if you don't actually own a device. It's just external if you do, right? But everyone sort of runs, and if you're Unitarian, but you're also running various different programs on your worship service is this, right? You're sort of picking and choosing, activating different apps at different times, and they all create a sort of corporate, right, sense of self and also performance of ritual. So you're already doing this, right? And in a way, you're sort of ahead of the curve, right? Because you've been doing this long before it was manifest in the form of the smartphone.
You're saying that there are programs that are just not computerized.
That's right.
digital.
That's right. Right. Religious rituals and even religions themselves can be viewed as the sort of apt or sort of structured kind of experience that then shapes the way that we see ourselves and interact with one
I
another.
think it's important you say can be because your previous sentences you say will be. And I feel this sense of danger that we'll lose touch with what is, from my pagan background, I say real. When I sit out in nature and when I see, the hummingbirds come on May 25th every year and, make friends with the chickadees and I see the progression of wildflowers through the year, I'm very in touch with something that's real. And if you're totally focused on something like this, then it becomes so separated that the danger is we're killing the bees and we have no more food pollinated to eat. And
Bats are going away.
Oh, yeah.
Frogs are going away.
I was thinking of something that Walt Peck introduced to one of these adult learning sessions some time ago. And there are many different ways to introduce the whole concept of interactivity to us older folks very successfully. And what he did was to hand everybody out little I don't know, buzzers or clicker things, whatever. And he registered people's clicks somewhere, somehow. And so you could click, and he used to do this with his students. He's a teacher, science teacher, and had all kinds of, ways that the class could, really focus, interact. And it was pretty cool. I forget exactly what he did. But then there's the whole kind of concept of, citizen science stuff, where everybody can make a difference, everybody can pitch in and make a little bit of a difference, and you get none of that happening, then it's,
So that would be a really interesting lesson to do because on the one hand it shows, right, that sort of shared experience, and then you'd also want to ask the questions always have to be yes or no, or A or B, right, so you could talk about that too, right, in what way might the clicker sort of then limit the kinds of questions and experiences that it can have. It can do both, right, it can bring people together, but it also, the procedural rhetoric then limits too.
You have a clicker question about what kind of question, is this a good question, yes or no, is this question better than this, yes or no, you could go all sorts.
But you couldn't say, how do you feel about A, B, right? So it does change, right, the discussion, not necessarily in a bad way, but sort of making that part of a layer of the experience too.
I want to comment that virtual experiences of whatever mechanism, not only computer-based, have a different cost versus scope and so on. But focus a moment on the cost. Taking an airplane ride virtually costs, I don't know, a couple nickels or something. Not much. Whereas doing it in real is quite expensive. And this goes on to a lot of things, and especially what would be the cost of a trip to Mars? Virtually not that much, but of course it's not complete. But you can get it done in a lot less time. So the cost in terms of time, as well as money, as well as resources and so on. So there's a real place. The other comment is that virtual realities, people have mentioned statues and so on, representing things and so on. It's not all that new. I mean, take for example a novel. A trip to Spain via a novel is
very virtual.
Or science fiction novels, one of my favorites. Go places that nobody can go.
Yeah.
But that's a different sort of thing, Dick. I mean, I think that's an individual interacting with the author in a context that is, you have accepted as such. This notion here, it's an entertainment context, as opposed to what I'm seeing here is a groupthink. This is the combination of Aldous Huxley and Brave New World in the context of also 1984. I mean, he's talking about this there's a lot of stuff here interweaved that suggests that society is being reformed in a way that is, I don't think we know what the answer is.
But I think it's
deformed, I think it's.
I think it's a spectrum. I think it's a spectrum. I think Dick's pointing at one thing on the spectrum, and you're saying, well, that's not the same as this point on the spectrum, but I think it's a spectrum. And yeah, we can't tell where it's going to end up, but it's a continuous kind of involvement. Jesus going up on the mountaintop was that virtual reality, according to the reports.
He went to the desert, I think, not the mountaintop.
Well, the thing was, he was stood on the mountain, he was put on the mountaintop and said, you can have all this land. And the whole devil, that was all that virtual reality stuff going on. And by the way, the record would say that was a group of practicing Jews who were out in the desert doing that stuff on a regular basis. I have a Sherry Turkle question.
Well, it's 10:16, it's your time. What
Yeah,
are
right,
your thoughts?
We sometimes get...
When the last thing I do, I want to tell you these terms, but I don't have to do it now. I can do it after your question.
No, go ahead.
Your time. Okay. All right. So this is the new direction that I'm going in my work. Cosmopolitanism is a philosophical school of thought. It actually is, I think, going to have a lot in common with the kinds of principles that drive Unitarian, which is living with tension. Knowing that one's never going to fully resolve one's differences with others, but being curious anyway, always growing and changing, and living with the paradoxes and complexities that come with accepting the global environment, working towards solutions that we may never fully arrive at, but still working with full conviction and compassion. Is a philosophical ideal. People argue about whether or not it's fully achievable and what that would look like and so forth. But that is very much at odds with algorithmic culture, this sort of binary thinking. And this is also what I just taught a class, an experimental class on what I'll call apocalyptic thinking, right? That desire to divide the world into us and them, enemies and friends, which is then mirrored in the kinds of games that attract us the most. And by us, I just mean culture at large, and probably especially young males who play the first-person shooters. This is attractive, and maybe it's a temporary escape for some, and maybe it's a permanent abiding space for some. So there's a kind of tension at work here, and it's kind of a complex tension. But this is a more fruitful goal, but this is extremely tantalizing in a global environment. This is where we need to be, and yet we may never fully achieve it. This is achievable because you kill all the bad guys and you're done. So this is sort of another conceptual tool to sort of think about where we are, how to push people to that place, even though it's not satisfying because you're never done. There's no winner loser. You have to let go of all those binaries.
I think that's a really interesting contrast. I want to challenge that, though, because the notion of an algorithm doesn't require black and white thinking. And I think there are some very intriguing algorithms for
pushing towards this.
Exactly.
Of course. Yeah, this is a term from Mackenzie Ward, where he's really referring to very rigid forms of procedural rhetoric that shape our community. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, and these two engage in really interesting tensions once you start pushing at them.
We had a speaker here a month or so ago who talked about Bitcoin. I don't know if you know Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But if trust is one of the things that all of our institutions are designed to deal with, this is a very interesting algorithm for generating trust.
Interesting. Yeah. Yep.
And I would encourage you to take a developmental perspective.
Yeah.
This seems to be focused on someone who's already reached a certain stage of developmental maturity. And when you're talking about a 6-year-old playing a shoot 'em up game, I remember when my friend wouldn't let her son have guns and he picked up sticks.
That's true, of course.
It's just something that we have to go through some stages of cognitive development as well as emotional and spiritual.
And there can be forms of binary play that are harmless, right?
Well, it depends on your development.
It does, absolutely.
So when I left the computer and company I was with, which was Enmesh, for 25 years in interactive computing and technology, and went off to get a master's degree, Sherry Turkle was just cranking out. So she graduated from Harvard Ed School saying this technology is driving us into individual, not social interactive. It's damaging to our wider social stuff. And she's made a cottage industry out of that, going to MIT. I've always doubted that. I never went off and read, but you're sitting in an area where you're looking at this kind of, would you comment on, because she's still touting that.
She is.
But research is coming out that says people are in Facebook and people are in this and that and other thing, and they seem to have stronger connections than somebody who doesn't have a cell phone. So can you comment?
So Sherry Turkle is terrified, right? So she's sort of looking at the darkest places that technology can go. Jane McGonigal is another theorist. She wrote Reality is Broken. She's enamored with games. She thinks games will save the world, and she actually says that directly. They're both apologists, right, for their sort of extreme position. And I really think, and this is also an aspect of cosmopolitanism, there's no single answer. For some people it's isolating, for other people it can develop group dynamics. Those group dynamics will come with a price, they'll bring new benefits, right? We really just have to let go of the notion that there's going to be some single answer, right? And we have to return, I think, to the notion of what it means to engage with other humans in positive ways, and how can that be practiced in this environment? How can it be practiced in this environment? We're not excused from being conscious individuals just because we have the technology to help us. It'd be nice if that were true, but it's not.
Well, yeah, the technology is nothing, should never be used, thought more of than as a tool to expedite something. And the question, and we live in, there, as just pointed out, there is no, the cosmopolitanism issue, it seems to me, relates to, training is applied at colleges. So I see all kinds of interconnections all the time.
Yeah.
There is no one path.
Right.
And getting people to understand and accept that as a reality that actually can transform oneself in a new creative way seems to me to be much more positive than having binary decision making.
Right, right. This is the kind of thinking that our technology urges us away from, that complexity. It's constantly pulling us towards simplicity, sorting, organizing, right, programming, giving our control over to other people who then structure our lives for us because they're so very complicated, too many things going on. But we actually, as human beings, we have to sit with that complexity. If we don't, then we're going to find, that our waters are ruined, that we've run out of fossil fuels and have no other plan. The Earth is going to keep falling apart. We're not even getting into issues like e-waste and destruction of rainforests for the building of materials that produce these presumably virtual environments that have no cost. They actually do. They have the physical cost to the Earth as well. And the disposal, right, planned obsolescence, there's a whole field of study there. This does not come for free. And it's not,
Do you have a book coming out on the correlation between religion and politics?
No.
What is your second book? Can you?
It's going to be called, it's going to be called God, Games, and Guns. And I'm interested in focusing on that binary aspect of gaming and technology. And I started wondering, how does that intersect with things like zombie culture and NRA, gun violence, right? Overweening patriotism, right? And so I really want to address that problem of the binary. It's about the interaction between these two things and sort of arguing for this more cosmopolitan point of view in response to actual warfare that is now played as a game. This is a training module, right, at Fort Sill, where those are virtual planes. So our desire for these kinds of imposition of gaming structures onto reality and the way that it prevents us from seeing global complexity. So that's what I'm interested in.
Great.
Shall we say thank you?
Yeah. Thank you.